I learned about the HOA's new fuel storage policy the same way I learned about most of their ridiculous rules. Through a certified letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was replacing the oil in my generator. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood there in my garage in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, holding the envelope with one hand and a dipstick with the other. The letter was signed by Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, and it informed me in the most condescending language possible that, effective immediately, all residents of Meadowbrook Estates were prohibited from storing more than 5 gallons of any petroleum-based fuel on their property. This included gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and propane tanks larger than standard barbecue grill size. Violations would result in fines starting at $500 per day. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little higher. 5 gallons. They wanted to limit me to 5 gallons. My backup generator required diesel fuel, and I kept a 275-gallon tank specifically for emergencies. Living in Georgia, we got our share of severe weather, and I had installed the whole system 2 years ago after a tornado knocked out power to our neighborhood for 4 days straight. My wife Sarah had been 8 months pregnant at the time, and sweltering in the June heat without air conditioning had convinced me that we needed a backup plan. I walked into the house, still holding the letter. My son Tommy was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Sarah was preparing dinner. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, setting down her knife. I handed her the letter. She read it silently, her expression shifting from curious to annoyed to outright angry. "They cannot be serious. $500 a day in fines," I said. "I have 270 gallons in that tank right now. According to this, I am in violation by 265 gallons. Sarah set the letter on the counter with more force than necessary. "On what grounds? That is your property, Grayson. You paid for that system." "Apparently there was some complaint about safety concerns," I said, scanning the letter again. "They cited fire hazard regulations, but I checked with the fire department before I installed everything. It is all up to code. The tank is double-walled, sits on a concrete pad, and is more than 50 feet from the house." Tommy looked up from his homework. "Does this mean the generator won't work anymore, Dad?" "Not if I can help it," I said. The next day, I took time off work and went to the HOA office, which was really just a converted house at the entrance to our subdivision. Patricia Henderson sat behind a large desk that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. She was in her mid-50s, with blonde hair that looked like she spent more time at the salon than most people spent at their jobs, and she wore a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Parker," she said, not bothering to stand or offer a handshake. "I assume you are here about the fuel storage policy." "You assume correctly," I said, remaining standing since she hadn't invited me to sit. "I need to understand the reasoning behind this. My generator system is completely legal and up to code." "The HOA has the right to implement rules that we believe protect property values and resident safety," Patricia said, folding her hands on her desk. "Several residents have expressed concerns about large fuel storage." "Which residents?" I asked. "Because I would like to speak with them about their concerns. Maybe we can address this reasonably." Patricia's smile was thin and cold. "That information is confidential. The point is that the board voted and the policy is now in effect. You have until Friday to remove the excess fuel or you will begin accruing fines." "Friday? That is 3 days away." "Where exactly do you expect me to put 270 gallons of diesel fuel?" she shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both dismissive and aggressive. "That is not the HOA's concern. You could sell it, donate it, use it. We do not care, but it cannot remain on your property in that quantity." I leaned forward, placing my hands on her desk. "Let me be very clear. That generator and fuel tank saved my family during the last major power outage. My wife was pregnant. The heat was dangerous. That system is a safety measure, not a hazard. And let me be very clear, Mr. Parker, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a tone that suggested she was used to getting her way. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased your home. That agreement states that you will comply with all rules and regulations as determined by the board. This is now a rule. You will comply or you will face consequences. I straightened up, realizing I was getting nowhere. I want to see the meeting minutes from this vote. I want to know who voted for this and what the actual safety concerns are. You can submit a formal request in writing, Patricia said, already looking back at her computer screen. We will respond within 30 business days as required by our bylaws. 30 days. The deadline you gave me is 3 days. Then I suggest you get started on removing that fuel, she said without looking up. I left the office furious but determined not to let this go. When I got home, I started making calls. First, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Marcus Chen, and his office was in downtown Atlanta. After explaining the situation, he was quiet for a moment. They can implement reasonable rules, Marcus said finally, but the key word is reasonable. If your system is legal and up to code, and they are giving you only 3 days to dispose of a large quantity of hazardous material, that could be argued as unreasonable. However, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. How expensive? I asked. Tens of thousands, potentially. And it could take months or even years. I thanked him and hung up, feeling defeated. Sarah came into my home office and sat down across from me. What did he say? I explained the situation. She shook her head. We do not have that kind of money to fight them, Grayson. Not with Tommy's college fund to think about and the roof needing replacement soon. So what do we do? Just let them win. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What if you moved the fuel, not off the property, just into smaller containers that technically comply with their rule? I considered it. They said no more than 5 gallons. If I broke it up into multiple 5-gallon cans, I would need 55 containers. Where would I even store them? And that seems like it violates the spirit of the rule even if it technically complies with the letter. Then what about getting rid of most of it but keeping enough to run the generator for a few days? Sarah suggested. That defeats the whole purpose, I said. The point is to have enough for an extended outage. A few days is not enough. We went back and forth for the rest of the evening but could not come up with a solution that felt right. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was my neighbor, Frank Morrison, who lived 2 houses down. Grayson, did you get one of those letters about fuel storage? He asked. Yeah, I did. You too? Just got mine yesterday. I keep about 50 gallons for my tractor and lawn equipment. This is ridiculous. A few of us are talking about going to the next HOA meeting to protest this. When is it? I asked. Next Tuesday night. Can you make it? Absolutely, I said. But Tuesday would be too late. The deadline was Friday tomorrow. I spent Thursday trying to figure out what to do. I called several companies that might take bulk diesel fuel, but none were interested in such a small quantity or could not come out on such short notice. By Thursday evening, I still had not resolved anything. That night, Sarah and I sat on the back porch while Tommy played video games inside. The weather was getting cooler as October progressed, but there was something in the air that felt ominous. I checked the weather forecast on my phone and saw that a major storm system was predicted to move through Georgia over the weekend, potentially bringing severe thunderstorms and high winds. Look at this, I said, showing Sarah the forecast. We might actually need that generator this weekend. Maybe that will change their minds, Sarah said hopefully. If the power goes out and people realize how important backup systems are. I doubt Patricia Henderson cares, I said bitterly. She probably has a whole house generator hooked up to natural gas. Friday morning arrived and I still had not removed any fuel. I was not going to. I had decided that if they wanted to find me, they could find me and I would deal with the consequences. At least my family would be safe if the power went out. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Patricia Henderson standing there with another woman I did not recognize. Patricia was holding a clipboard and had her phone in her other hand. "Mr. Parker," she said formally, "I am here to verify compliance with the fuel storage policy. The deadline was noon today." "I am not in compliance," I said flatly. "And I do not intend to be." Patricia made a note on her clipboard. "Then, as of this moment, you are being fined $500 per day until the violation is corrected. Additionally, if you do not comply within 7 days, we will pursue legal action to force removal of the fuel and potentially the entire tank system." "You do that," I said, "and I will see you in court." The woman with Patricia held up a phone and took several pictures of my garage and the side yard where the fuel tank sat. I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me. "Who are you?" I asked the woman. "Susan Mallory," she said, "HOA compliance officer." "We hired her specifically to handle violations," Patricia added with a satisfied smile. "You are her first case. Congratulations," I said to Susan, who at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I hope you are getting paid well to harass people who are just trying to protect their families." "This is not harassment," Patricia snapped. "This is enforcement of community standards. Community standards that you invented last week," I shot back. "Based on complaints you will not specify from residents you will not name." Patricia's face flushed. "The board voted unanimously. How many people are on the board? 3, 4, that is hardly representative of the whole community." "We were elected fairly," Patricia said. "If you do not like how we run things, you are welcome to run for the board yourself next year." "Maybe I will," I said. They left, and I watched them get into Patricia's white Mercedes SUV and drive away. I felt a mixture of anger and anxiety. $500 a day added up fast. If they really pushed the 7-day ultimatum, that would be $3,500 in fines before legal action even started. Saturday morning arrived with dark clouds and the distant rumble of thunder. The storm forecast had been accurate. By early afternoon, the wind was picking up significantly, and the Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for our area. Sarah made sure we had flashlights and batteries ready, just in case, but I felt confident in the generator system. The storm hit around 4 in the afternoon. It was intense, with winds that made the trees in our yard bend at alarming angles and rain that came down in sheets so thick you could barely see the street. Tommy watched from the living room window, fascinated by the raw power of nature. Sarah and I watched too, but I was also keeping an eye on our electronics, waiting to see if we would lose power. At 4:37, the lights flickered twice and went out. Our house was suddenly silent except for the sound of the storm. Through the window, I could see that the entire street was dark. "Wait here," I said. I went through the garage and outside, getting soaked instantly, and made my way to the generator. I had tested it regularly, and it started on the second pull. The engine rumbled to life, and within 30 seconds, the automatic transfer switch kicked in. I ran back inside, dripping water everywhere, and heard Sarah cheer as the lights came back on. "We have power," Tommy shouted. I changed into dry clothes and then checked the generator from the garage window. It was running smoothly, protected under its weather shelter. The diesel tank was full, and according to my calculations, I had enough fuel to run for at least 10 to 12 days of continuous use if needed, probably longer if we were careful about what we ran. The storm continued through the evening and into the night. I checked the local utility company's outage map on my phone and saw that over 15,000 customers in our area were without power, including apparently our entire subdivision based on the density of red dots on the map. Sunday morning, the storm had passed, but the damage was evident. Trees were down all over the neighborhood and branches and debris littered the streets. More importantly, the power was still out. I walked outside to check on the generator and found Frank Morrison standing in the street, looking at my house. "You have power," he called out. "Generator," I said. He walked over, looking exhausted. My house is freezing. The temperature dropped into the 40s last night. My wife has been cold all night. Come inside, I said. Warm up, have some coffee. Frank and his wife Linda came over and Sarah made coffee and breakfast. They sat in our warm kitchen, grateful for the heat and hot food. Tommy was in the living room watching cartoons, completely oblivious to how unusual it was that we had power when nobody else did. How much fuel do you have for that thing? Frank asked. Enough, I said carefully, not wanting to advertise the exact amount. More than 5 gallons, I bet, Frank said with a knowing look. Did you get rid of it like Patricia demanded? No, I said. I am being fined $500 a day. Linda looked shocked. They are fining you for having the fuel that is currently keeping your house warm, apparently, Sarah said. We talked for a while, and Frank mentioned that several other neighbors were struggling without power. Some had left to stay with family or in hotels. Others were toughing it out with cold houses and no way to cook food. Where does Patricia Henderson live? I asked suddenly. Oak Ridge Court, Frank said. Why? Just curious if she is experiencing the same outage we are. Frank pulled out his phone and checked the outage map. Yeah, her street is definitely out. The whole subdivision is out. By Sunday afternoon, the power still had not come back on. I checked the utility company's estimate, and they were saying it could be several days due to the extent of the damage. Crews were working around the clock, but there were trees on power lines all over the county. Around 3 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Patricia Henderson standing there, and for the first time since I had met her, she did not look perfectly put together. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore yoga pants and a hoodie, and her face was free of makeup. She looked cold, Mr. Parker, she said, and her voice was different too, less imperious and more tentative. I noticed your house has power. Yes, I said simply. My house does not. None of our houses do. The utility company says it will be at least 3 more days, maybe longer. I am aware, I said. Patricia shifted her weight from foot to foot. I was wondering if I could possibly stay here, just during the day to warm up. I would pay you, of course. I stared at her for a long moment, letting the irony of the situation sink in. Here was the woman who had threatened me with fines and legal action, standing on my porch, asking to benefit from the very system she had tried to force me to dismantle. No, I said, her eyes widened. Excuse me. You heard me. No, you cannot come in. But I am cold, she said, and there was a note of desperation in her voice. My house is 50 degrees inside. I have been staying in my car with the heat running to warm up, but I am almost out of gas. That sounds like a personal problem, I said, echoing the tone she had used with me in her office. You could go to a hotel or stay with family, I do not care, but you cannot stay here. This is ridiculous, Patricia said, her imperious tone returning. I am asking for basic humanitarian help. And I am protecting my family with a generator system that you tried to make me dismantle, I said. The same system that is currently the only reason my house is warm. The system powered by the fuel you ordered me to remove. Patricia's face went red. I am still the HOA president. I could make things very difficult for you. You already are, I said. I am being fined $500 a day, remember? Now, if you will excuse me, I have a warm house to get back to. I closed the door. Through the window, I watched Patricia stand on the porch for a moment, clearly shocked, before she turned and walked back to her car. Sarah had heard the whole exchange from the kitchen. That was harsh, she said, but she was smiling. She deserves it, I said. Over the next few days, the neighborhood became increasingly desperate. The temperature stayed in the 40s, and without heat, houses became uncomfortable and even dangerous for elderly residents or those with health issues. Several neighbors came by, asking politely if they could warm up for a few hours. Unlike Patricia, I let them in. Frank and Linda became regular visitors. An elderly couple from down the street, Robert and Martha, came by and spent several hours each day sitting in our living room. Grateful for the warmth, on Tuesday, the scheduled HOA meeting still took place. though it was moved to a local library that had power. I attended, and so did about 30 other residents, which was far more than usually showed up. Patricia sat at a table in the front with the 3 other board members, Sharon Winters, David Kim, and Thomas Reynolds. "We will now open the floor for resident comments," Patricia said, looking tired and irritable. Frank stood up first. "I want to talk about this fuel storage policy. It is clear now after this outage that backup generators are not luxuries, they are necessities. Grayson Parker is the only person in this neighborhood who has power right now, and it is because he had the foresight to install a proper backup system with adequate fuel. Meanwhile, you are fining him for having that system." Several people applauded. Patricia looked uncomfortable. "The policy is about safety," she said. "What safety?" Someone else called out. "Freezing in our houses, that seems pretty unsafe to me." "Properly stored fuel is not dangerous," Frank continued. "Grayson's system is up to code and was inspected. This policy is arbitrary and punitive." "I agree," Martha, the elderly woman, stood up slowly. "My husband and I are in our 70s. Our house has been in the 40s for days. If it were not for Grayson letting us come over and warm up, I do not know what we would have done. We could have gotten sick. This policy makes no sense." Patricia looked at the other board members who seemed uncertain. "The board will take your comments under advisement." "That is not good enough," I said, standing up. "I want the policy repealed tonight. Right now, take a vote." "We cannot just overturn a policy because you demand it," Patricia said. "Why not?" I asked. "You created it without any real community input. 4 people voted on it. There are 30 people in this room right now saying it is a bad policy. That should count for something." David Kim, one of the other board members, spoke up. "Patricia, maybe we should reconsider. I think Mr. Parker has a point. The policy does seem to be causing more problems than it solves." "We voted on this," Patricia said through gritted teeth. "Then we can vote again," Sharon Winters said. "I move to repeal the fuel storage restriction policy." "Second," David Kim said immediately. Patricia looked furious but had no choice. "All in favor," Sharon and David raised their hands. Thomas Reynolds hesitated, then raised his hand as well. Patricia sat with her arms crossed. "The motion passes 3-1, Sharon announced. "The fuel storage policy is repealed." The room erupted in applause. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Patricia gathered her papers and left the meeting without another word. On Wednesday, 5 days after the storm, power started being restored to parts of the neighborhood. By Thursday morning, most houses had electricity again, including Patricia's street. My generator had run continuously for nearly a week, and I had used about 70 gallons of diesel, leaving me with about 200 gallons still in the tank. I thought the matter was settled, but I was wrong. On Friday, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This one informed me that despite the repeal of the fuel storage policy, I still owed $3,500 in fines for the 7 days I had been in violation before the repeal. Additionally, Patricia was claiming that I had created a public nuisance by allowing multiple residents to visit my home during the outage, violating occupancy limits and creating traffic congestion. I called Marcus Chen, the lawyer, immediately. "Can she do this?" I asked after explaining the situation. "The fines are tricky," Marcus said. "Technically, you were in violation during those days even though the policy has since been repealed. However, the public nuisance claim is absurd. You were helping your neighbors during an emergency. No judge would side with the HOA on that. So what do I do? Do not pay the fines. Let them take you to court if they want. Based on what you have told me, I do not think they have a leg to stand on, and once we get in front of a judge, I think you will be fine." 2 weeks later, I received a court summons. The HOA was suing me for the unpaid fines plus legal fees, now totaling over $5,000. Marcus agreed to represent me, and we prepared for what he called the easiest case I will handle all year. The court date was set for December 15th. In the meantime, life returned to normal. The neighborhood recovered from the storm, power was fully restored, and people stopped talking about the outage. But I noticed that Patricia avoided me entirely. If she saw me outside, she would turn and go the other direction. I was fine with that. When December 15th arrived, I met Marcus at the courthouse in downtown Atlanta. It was a civil courtroom, and the HOA had hired their own lawyer, a stern-looking man named Richard Abbott. Patricia was there, along with Susan Mallory, the compliance officer. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Catherine Morrison. She listened as Richard Abbott presented the HOA's case, arguing that I had willfully violated a legitimate policy and was now refusing to pay legitimate fines. Then Marcus stood up and presented our side. He brought up the timeline, showing that the policy had been created with minimal notice and repealed within 2 weeks after community backlash. He presented affidavits from Frank, Martha, Robert, and several other neighbors who testified that my generator and willingness to share warmth during the outage had been essential to their health and safety. He also presented documentation from the fire department confirming that my generator system was fully compliant with all safety codes. Judge Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. When both sides had presented their cases, she sat back and looked at the paperwork in front of her. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said. "The HOA created a policy limiting fuel storage. Mr. Parker did not comply because he believed the policy was unreasonable and unsafe. During the time he was supposedly in violation, a major storm caused a week-long power outage. Mr. Parker's generator, powered by the fuel the HOA wanted removed, kept his home operational. He then shared that warmth with elderly and vulnerable neighbors. After seeing the situation, the HOA board repealed the policy. But now the HOA president wants to fine Mr. Parker for violating a policy that no longer exists, and that was clearly beneficial to the community during an emergency." "That is correct, Your Honor," Richard Abbott said. "The dates of the violation are clear, Mr. Abbott," Judge Morrison said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "I have been a judge for 23 years. I have seen a lot of frivolous lawsuits in that time. This one ranks near the top." Richard Abbott's face went pale. "Your Honor, the HOA has a right to enforce its rules." "Reasonable rules, yes," Judge Morrison said. "Unreasonable rules that put residents in danger. No, Mr. Parker's actions during that outage were not just reasonable, they were commendable. He helped his neighbors. He did what any decent person would do, and now you want to punish him for it." She looked at Patricia directly. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand you are the HOA president. Is that correct?" Patricia stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you personally benefit from Mr. Parker's generator during the outage?" Patricia hesitated. "I asked if I could stay at his home to warm up, but he refused." "Did you ask anyone else if you could stay at their homes?" "No, Your Honor, they did not have power." "Because they did not have generators," Judge Morrison said. "Because they did not have the fuel storage that you tried to ban. Do you see the irony here?" Patricia did not answer. Judge Morrison looked back at the documents. "I am dismissing this case with prejudice. The HOA will pay Mr. Parker's legal fees. Additionally, I am ordering the HOA to reimburse Mr. Parker for any costs he incurred in providing assistance to his neighbors during the outage, including the fuel he used. Do you have those receipts, Mr. Parker?" Marcus nudged me, and I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I used approximately 70 gallons of diesel at current prices. That is about $245. I also had pizza delivered for neighbors several times, which was another $100 or so." "The HOA will reimburse you $350 plus your legal fees," Judge Morrison said. She looked at Patricia again. "Mrs. Henderson, let me be very clear. If you bring another frivolous case like this to my courtroom, I will hold you personally responsible. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said quietly. The gavel came down and the case was over. Outside the courtroom, Marcus shook my hand. "I told you it would be easy." "Thank you," I said. "Send me your bill. Already done, he said with a smile, and the HOA is paying it. I drove home feeling vindicated but also exhausted. The whole ordeal had taken months and caused unnecessary stress. When I got home, Sarah hugged me tightly. "It is over," she asked. "It is over," I confirmed. That evening, Frank called to congratulate me. Apparently, word had spread through the neighborhood quickly. "You know what the best part is?" Frank said. "Patricia resigned from the HOA board this afternoon. Susan Mallory quit too. Apparently, Patricia was so embarrassed by the judge's ruling that she could not face being president anymore." "Good," I said. "Maybe whoever replaces her will have some common sense." The following week, I received a check from the HOA for Marcus's legal fees and my reimbursement costs. It totaled just over $4,000. I deposited it and considered the matter closed. In January, the HOA held special elections for the board positions that Patricia and Susan had vacated. Frank ran for president and won easily. One of his first acts was to formally rescind any and all policies that had been put in place in the previous year without proper community input. He also implemented new rules requiring that any major policy changes be announced at least 60 days in advance with community feedback sessions. Life in Meadowbrook Estates improved significantly. People were friendlier, and there was a sense that the neighborhood was actually a community now rather than just a collection of houses ruled by an arbitrary authority. One Saturday in February, I was outside doing maintenance on the generator when Patricia's white Mercedes SUV drove past. She was moving out. I watched as a moving truck pulled up to her house and movers began loading furniture. Frank came over and stood next to me. "She sold the house," Frank said. "Moving to a condo in Buckhead apparently, no HOA there ironically." "Good riddance," I said. "You know what the funny thing is," Frank said. "I talked to David Kim, one of the other former board members. He told me that the whole fuel storage policy was Patricia's idea from the start. She was the only one who really wanted it. The others went along because she pushed so hard." "What was her reasoning?" I asked. Frank shrugged. "David said she mentioned something about lowering insurance costs, but he never saw any actual data. He thinks she just did not like looking at your fuel tank from the street." "She could have just asked me to plant some shrubs to screen it," I said. "That would have required her to talk to you like a reasonable person," Frank said. We watched the moving truck for a while longer. The movers were efficient, and within a few hours, most of Patricia's belongings were loaded up. I never saw her again after that day. She drove away in her Mercedes without a backward glance at the neighborhood she had tried to rule with an iron fist. Spring came to Georgia with its usual explosion of green and warmth. The trees that had been damaged in the October storm had been removed or trimmed, and the neighborhood looked better than ever. Tommy finished 4th grade with good grades. Sarah got a promotion at her job. And I continued to maintain my generator and fuel tank, grateful that I had stood my ground. One evening in May, I was sitting on the back porch with Sarah, watching the sunset and enjoying the warm breeze. Tommy was at a friend's house for a sleepover. It was peaceful and quiet. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just complied?" Sarah asked suddenly. "If you had removed the fuel like Patricia wanted," I considered it. "We would have been cold and miserable during that outage. So would have Frank and Linda and Robert and Martha and everyone else who came over. And Patricia would still be HOA president, probably making everyone's lives difficult," Sarah added. "Sometimes you have to stand up to unreasonable people," I said, "even when it is hard. Even when it costs money and time and stress. Because if you do not, they just keep pushing." Sarah took my hand. "I am proud of you. You did the right thing." A few weeks later, I was at the hardware store buying supplies when I ran into David Kim, the former board member. We chatted for a few minutes about the neighborhood and how things were going under Frank's leadership. "I wanted to apologize," David said eventually. "I should have stood up to Patricia earlier. I knew the fuel policy was wrong, but I went along with it because it was easier than fighting." I appreciate you saying that, I said. And I appreciate you voting to repeal it when it mattered. Still, I should have done more, David said. After seeing how that whole situation played out, I realized that HOAs can be really dangerous when the wrong people are in charge. It is supposed to be about maintaining the neighborhood, not controlling people's lives. Exactly, I said. David shifted his shopping basket to his other hand. Frank told me about the judge's ruling. I wish I could have been there to see Patricia's face. It was pretty satisfying, I admitted. We said our goodbyes and I finished my shopping. As I drove home, I thought about how much had changed in just 7 months. The October storm seemed like it had happened years ago rather than months. But the lessons from it stuck with me. That summer was hot and humid, typical for Georgia. We had a few brief power outages due to storms, nothing major, but each time my generator kicked on seamlessly, providing backup power for a few hours until the utility restored service. Each time, I was grateful I had not given in to Patricia's demands. In August, Frank organized a neighborhood block party. It was the first one in years and almost everyone came. There were grills and coolers, kids running around playing games and adults chatting and laughing. It felt like what a neighborhood should feel like. I was manning the grill, flipping burgers, when Martha, the elderly woman who had spent so much time at my house during the outage, came over with her husband Robert. "Grayson," she said warmly. "These look wonderful, thank you for doing this." "Happy to help," I said. "I never properly thanked you for letting us stay at your house during that awful week," Martha said. "Robert and I talk about it sometimes. You probably saved us from getting very sick. Our house was so cold." "Anyone would have done the same," I said. "That is not true," Robert said quietly. "Patricia did not. She would have let us freeze if it meant enforcing her rules." "Well, she is gone now," I said, "and Frank is doing a good job." "Because of you," Martha said. "You stood up to her. You showed everyone that it was okay to push back against unreasonable rules. Thank you for that." She hugged me, and I felt a lump in my throat. I had not thought of my actions as particularly heroic. I had just been trying to protect my family and keep my home warm. But I realized that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance against petty tyranny can have ripple effects that change everything. The party went late into the evening. Someone set up speakers and